Bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to be able to stand and speak on this bill, the Financial Sector Reform Hayne Royal Commission Response No. 2 bill, which of course is part of the package of this government delivering on the recommendations of the Hayne Royal Commission since its report was handed down a couple of years ago. Now, I know there's a lot of colour and light going on the opposition benches, a bit of ranting and raving because they're saying why wasn't the bills introduced and legislated earlier. There was this thing, Deputy Speaker, called COVID-19. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but early last year there was, and we're still getting to the bottom of the origins, but most people think it came from Wuhan, China, and kind of distracted the political discussion and the priorities of governments, not just in Australia, but kind of all around the world. And so we had this reprioritisation to say, yes, these sorts of urgent reforms matter, but actually saving human lives, protecting the Australian community, making sure we had the health systems necessary, making sure we provided the economic support measures to make sure people lose jobs, it kind of mattered a bit more. So the confected outrage of those members on the opposition benches kind of falls a bit flat, because what we're doing now that the Treasury has the bandwidth, the government has the bandwidth, and frankly this parliament has the bandwidth, is getting on with the job so that we can make sure that Australian consumers are protected, and the interests or the role of financial service firms is to manage and create the wealth of our great nation, but to do in alignment with those who own that wealth. And of course we've had reforms already, and there are many reforms to go, but there are of course other things that we need to focus on as well as a consequence that flow on of the Hayne Royal Commission. Now, this legislation is relatively straightforward. It's to make sure that financial advisors' interests are aligned to the interests of those people they're advising. You would have thought that it was something that was self-evident for financial advisors, that when they clip the ticket because they provide a service which is entirely reasonable and fair, that they do it on the basis they were actually helping the people who are gaining a benefit from their services, and that their interests should be in alignment, not in contrast. And certainly when fees are being charged, as clearly has occurred with some financial advisors, against the interests of their customers, that they are being rorted of their savings, their investments, because people are using it as an opportunity to mine for fees and their own interests. And if financial advisors are doing that, they should be held to account. And that's what this legislative proposal is partway through addressing. But we should never turn a blind eye, Deputy Speaker, to where we find this happen in other places. And as you may be aware, Deputy Speaker, I'm the chair of the Economics Committee. We've been overseeing, or we're running a term-long inquiry at the request of the Treasurer into the implementation of the Hayne Royal Commission. And the member for Dunkley probably wasn't on the committee when we discovered some super funds were also charging members fees without providing a service. And the only response from the opposition to this fee-for-no-service moment was to run interference and to distract from what was going on. And we wonder why, Deputy Speaker. It might be because it was being done by their friends in the industry super fund ecosystem. They actually were caught red-handed, reactivating low balance inactive accounts that should have gone to the Australian Taxation Office by law, and reactivating them so that they could harvest them for fees and insurances people didn't want, didn't need, because it could underwrite their profitability. It is the most despicable thing, in exactly the same way where financial advisors have been caught out by the Hayne Royal Commission. Hayne missed this one, and we have done something about it despite the efforts of the opposition. Because in the end, fees for no service is wrong, and it doesn't matter whether it's a financial advisor or an industry super fund. When they're caught red-handed, they're culpable, and we need to make sure we change the law to protect so. But this shows a fundamental blind spot of the opposition around financial services. Their interest is not in stopping wrongdoing. Their interest in financial services is what they can gain from it too, like the dodgy financial advisors that this bill is stopping. And that's what we discovered in the Economics Committee. But we're also seeing it in their behaviour around so many other issues around financial advice and prioritisation. Just before question time, Deputy Speaker, I drew an explicit contrast between the rhetoric of the Labor Party and the opposition and what they do. And I'll repeat it, just for clarity. When it comes to Labor, it's always them first, you last. At the last election, Labor said negative gearing cost housing affordability. This was their big narrative. That's what they do. And they conned millions of Australians into believing this lie. But they knew it wasn't true. And yesterday in the Nine Press, Labor MPs backgrounded that, quote, for the amount of money it raises versus the political plane, it's just not worth it, end quote, to scrap negative gearing. So clearly their only priority is not housing affordability. It's not improving the home ownership rate of young Australians. It's merely their take of your money. Either housing affordability mattered, but they'd rather votes, or it doesn't, and they just want your cash. Labor first, you last. And now they're doing the same thing with super. Since the 1990s, Labor has championed taking workers' wages to stop you saving a deposit to own your own home. Unsurprisingly, home ownership rates amongst young Australians has declined, while Labor has been prioritising super ahead of home ownership. The average age to buy a first home has now blown out to 36. Labor's solution is to double down and make it harder for you, the people of Australia, to save. Labor want a nation of renters. Home ownership gets in the way of handing moolah to their mates. Liberals want you to own your future, your security for you and your family. Liberals want a nation of home owners. And this is not the first time we had this debate. Back at the end of the Second World War, most people remember the divide between Chifley's Labor and Menzies' Liberal Party as being about bank nationalisation. But go back to the speeches and look at one of the other critical divides. And Labor wanted to use federal-state housing agreements to create a nation of dependent renters where people were denied the dignity and ownership of their own homes. And we were committed, Menzies was committed, and our party has been committed at every point to the democratisation of wealth creation and distribution through the power of home ownership. And we did it in 1949 and drew a stake in the stand. And it's hardly a shock that for many years after, the Australian people never forgot the betrayal of the opposition and the Labor Party for the aspiration for Australians to own their own home. Because Liberals want you to own your future. Super matters, but home ownership matters more. It should be home first, super second. And the only people who want to obsessively argue against it are the people who have their interests in the till of keeping the super system prioritised ahead of home ownership. That's why it's wrong. And I know a lot of members of the opposition find it outrageous that someone would dare say that home ownership matters more than super. There's such a con at the heart of their argument that they have no issue with your super being used to invest in build-to-rent housing. So super funds will own housing stock with your money and they will say that you must rent it from them. That is a betrayal of the Australian social contract. It is a disgrace. And they sit there on the other side of the chamber and applaud it along. The idea that you would rent off your own super fund from your own money is despicable. But that is where the Australian super system is heading, to create a neo-feudalism at the heart of Australian society, where young Australians, new Australians, migrant workers, low-income workers will be denied their own dream to serve the interests of super funds. to be serfs to their own super, rather than the dignity, the pride and the ownership they have, not just of their own home, but of this great country. And I know there's a mocking dismissal by members of the opposition, but that is where their priorities sit within the financial services sector. Labor first, you last. And they've taken that attitude in the Economics Committee, they take that attitude in this parliament, and they continue to mock and deride the opportunity for young Australians to be able to own their own home. And it's a disgrace. And they can't see it because they're blind, because at the heart of these debates, they see themselves and their interests, not the opportunities for you, the people of Australia. So in this piece of legislation, we are taking sensible action to make sure that financial advisors don't rip off customers. We've already done the same where we found industry super funds ripping off fund members and those with low balance accounts, sometimes the most underprivileged and low-income Australians. But again, the member for Dunkley simply shrugs her shoulders at the rip-offs of industry super against nurses and teachers and those people who made the effort to be able to save for their own dignity. Now give them the choice, the opportunity to empower themselves. Give them the opportunity to be able to use their savings, their money, their effort, their reward to own their own home. But instead we'll get the sneering arrogance of the opposition to oppose it every step of the way. And my response is, bring this fight on, because it should be home first, super second.
I thank the member for Goldstein. The